The debate over whether Canada should sell arms to Saudi Arabia re-emerged this week. CBC has learned that officials at Global Affairs Canada have given the green light to existing and new arms exports to Saudi Arabia. A briefing note written in September for the Minister of Foreign Affairs says officials found no credible evidence linking Canadian exports of military equipment or other controlled items to any human rights or humanitarian law violations committed by the Saudi government. The department, it goes on to say, has assessed and processed a further 48 permit applications for exports of controlled goods to KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, on a case-by-case basis. Those permits have been deemed ready for approval by officials and await your further consideration. Canada announced a freeze and a review of arms sales to Saudi Arabia, of course, last year, following the brutal killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. These documents were made public as part of a request for a judicial review of Canadian arms exports to Saudi Arabia. Daniel Turp is behind that legal proceeding. He's a law professor at the University of Montreal and a former MP for the Bloc Québécois. He joins us now from Montreal. Hi, Professor Turp. Nice to see you.
Good afternoon, Vashi.
Thanks for your time. Let me get your reaction first to this document, which, as we said, was released as a part of your legal proceeding.
I saw that document about 10 days ago. The lawyers of the Minister of Foreign Affairs sent it to me, and I was a bit surprised because there's so little information. We now know there's 48 permits that are waiting to be approved by the minister. That would mean, or could mean, that more exports of those light armored vehicles could proceed, and that's why I took this case again, because that shouldn't happen. Saudi Arabia is the worst country when it comes to violations of human rights on its own soil in Yemen. So it's a battle that I'm going to continue to fight until I win, and others want to see end by the cancellation of those permits.
To be fair, those permits, there's 48 of them. They haven't been signed by the government yet. They're sort of in a queue. And the government said, following the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, that they would halt the export of new product and that they would be reviewing the deal as a whole. Of course, that was about a year ago. What is your take on what you think might happen with that review?
Well, we don't know, and there's so little transparency on what has happened since that review started, since the Khashoggi murder, and but it looks like the Global Affairs Department is telling the minister, well, you can go ahead now, because there's no risk, substantial risk, that these vehicles could be used to breach human rights in Yemen. And that's where I totally disagree.
Why?
Because especially since Canada has become party to the Arms Trade Treaty. This treaty says that if you have a knowledge that human rights or the international humanitarian law has been breached in a country, in Yemen in this case, you just shouldn't export goods and military goods to a country like that. So that's Article 6. And there's this other article that says if there's a substantial risk that this equipment be used to breach human rights, you shouldn't also send that material to Saudi Arabia. And I think it would be a clear violation of that new treaty that Canada has just become party to go ahead and allow those permits to be delivered.
So let me ask you then, should the calculation be for the government in determining whether or not they're going to proceed with this deal, that they're selling arms, period, to a country that has that is known to violate human rights and has a bad human rights record? Or should it be, as this document squarely points to, the consideration of whether or not this product is being used to violate human rights specifically? Like, should it be the bigger picture or something specific to the labs?
Well, it's the bigger picture, and that's what the Arms Trade Treaty is all about. It's not, and the test and the criteria that the government is trying to convince us that is the good criteria is if labs that were exported to Saudi Arabia have not been used in the past, there's no risk. But that's not what the treaty says. The treaty says if there is a risk in the future, then you shouldn't export those military goods. But there's even something more important, because this new treaty says that if you have knowledge that there has been breaches of international humanitarian law and human rights law, you shouldn't export. And this knowledge is so evident after what the United Nations has said, the group of experts of the Security Council, the group of eminent experts of the Human Rights Council, NGOs, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. It's obvious that equipment like labs have been used by Saudi Arabia and Yemen in breach of international law.
The government has defended the length of time it's taking to review this decision or this agreement by pointing to how complicated it is and also highlighting that there would be penalties attached to breaking the contract. We don't know what the exact penalties are because the agreement has been secret, but should there be some credence given to that argument? Is it not understandable that that be a part of the considerations that they have to make?
Not when human rights are concerned. Not when the issue is the lives of many children, women, and civilians that have been killed in Yemen. And it's clear that there's been serious breaches of international humanitarian law. And Canada should not just say, well, I'm sorry, there's commercial considerations and there's the fight against terrorism by Saudi Arabia. What has happened in Yemen is terrible in terms of human rights. And the fact that Canada would pay a penalty is not relevant when it comes to human rights. And Canada is one of the only countries now, apart from the United States, that hasn't done anything. Germany has suspended its.
Well, they have suspended. To be fair, though, they have suspended new exports. They haven't sent new labs there, but they just haven't made the decision on the contract altogether.
Oh, well, the important exports are about these labs and about the 728, vehicles that are to be sent to Saudi Arabia, although there's probably almost 200 that have been sent already. So this is the issue. The issue is that you should annul the permits that have already been delivered in 2016 that had already allowed the export of several labs to Saudi Arabia. And these new permits, these 48 new permits, if they do apply to these labs, but we don't know. I've asked the government to provide me documents in this new case, and they've refused to make public documents except the memorandum for
What's their justification? Did they offer any justification for refusing?
No. Well, commercial secrets, national security, and they use the Access of Information Act exceptions. There's so many, but this is an issue that is very important, I think, to citizens of Canada, and the fact that you're not releasing information on what this contract is all about, what are the penalties, is very worrying in terms of transparency and democracy. And you think I don't think I'll be alone in this forthcoming battle in front of the federal court, because I'm discussing with Canadian NGOs now, and I'm going to have a meeting in early December, and I think I'm not the only one that's going to be arguing that these exports to Saudi Arabia are illegal and they're inconsistent with Canada's commitments under international law now. And they're inconsistent with the idea that when human rights are concerned, the foreign policy of Canada should give importance to human rights. And hopefully this time around, a court, the federal court, will want to look into this more carefully. And want to annul these permits.
Is it formally then that you might be joining with other partners, like they might be joining your challenge as well?
Yes, I do hope so, that some Canadian NGOs that have expressed concerns in the last years, Amnesty International, the Rideau Institute, and others, that they will join me in this fight. And what's going to be very important, I was in London last week and I met some lawyers that are working on a very similar case for an NGO that's called Campaign Against Trade in Arms. And they've won a case in front of the Court of Appeal a few months ago. And they succeeded in having judges be given evidence and looking at the documents that the government uses to determine if there's a risk or not. And I'm looking into trying to get a judge to see the evidence and see why the government does not believe there's a risk or doesn't have the knowledge it has on these issues of human rights violations in Yemen by Saudi Arabia and other countries of the coalition.
Okay,
so
I have to leave it there. I'm sorry, I'm out of time, Professor Terp.
It's okay.
Pardon me. Thank you very much, though, and hopefully you'll keep us apprised of the progress with your challenge.
I will, with great pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thanks to law professor Danielle Terp. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.